So here's our first example of a somewhat atypical windmill. And this is the first of two examples, and in each game we're going to take an example where the windmill maneuver was executed by two of the true greats of chess of the past. This game was played between Donald Byrne with the white pieces, a very strong player in his own right, and a very, very young Bobby Fischer, who needs no introduction, I think, in the world of chess, one of the most famous, if not the most famous name in chess, right? Now, Bobby Fischer was only 13 years old at the time that this game was played, but he was already incredibly strong, and here he shows a real flash of brilliance. So in this position, the material is currently equal in terms of the number of pieces, although black is up a pawn, but the pawn won't matter too much unless black can do something about this double attack. Now, a lesser player than Bobby would perhaps have played a move like knight to b5, reasoning that after bishop takes queen, there will be knight takes queen on a3, and that would be a pretty good deal for black, since he was already up a pawn and white also has problems with his king, his pawn on d4, etc. However, after knight to b5, things would actually not be clear at all because white has a clever tactical response. The move bishop takes f7, check. Now, the point behind this sacrifice is that if king takes bishop, the king is now exposed. Queen would then go to b3, check, gaining time, and the queen on b6 is attacked. Now, okay, the tactical sequence could continue. Black could play bishop to e6, saying you take my queen, I will take yours, and once again, still more fireworks. Knight g5, check, and there's a fork there. And clearly some very, very crazy tactics going on. But this is not really what we're interested in. So you'll have to investigate the complications for yourself, or take my word that if knight b5 had been played, with best play, white actually stands a little bit better. So Bobby here uncorked a beautiful move. Feel free to try and find it if you've never seen this game before, although it is far from obvious. So, okay, I'm gonna show the move right now. Bishop to e6. Now, this move solves all of black's problems. Amazing. A bishop retreat solves the problem of the queen being attacked, as we'll soon see, and it also solves the problem of the knight being attacked. Because as it turns out, if black in this position went something like queen to c7, then white could pick up a free knight. But as long as the black queen remains on b6 and challenging the bishop on c5, if white against bishop to e6 responds with queen takes knight, black has the clever response preying on the undefended and x-rayed queen on c3. Black goes queen takes c5. D takes c5, bishop takes c3 is the point. Bishop takes bishop, rook takes bishop, the dust is settled, and black is up a pawn and has a better structure, and certainly white has problems with his king. Now, at this level, Fischer was probably already grandmaster strength, and Donald Byrne similarly. So here, this is simply too much of a disaster. So Donald Byrne didn't go for that. After bishop to e6, he cannot take the knight. And so the question is, well, what else can he take? Can he perhaps take this bishop on e6 first? And then if black recaptures the bishop, then both the queen and the knight continue to hang. Well, the point is that if the bishop leaves the f1 to a6 diagonal, then black goes queen b5 check. Now, if king to e1, then queen e2 will be checkmate, so king must go to g1. Knight e2 check, king f1. Knight g3 check, king to e1 will once again lead to queen e2. King must step to g1. And now, there is much better, of course, than a perpetual. Black has a very nice smothered mate available to him. Queen f1 check, rook takes f1, and now knight e2 is checkmate. So this really would have been just a beautiful end, but in my opinion, it pales in comparison with what actually happened. So in this position, seeing that queen takes knight on c3 or bishop takes the bishop on e6, both fail, Donald Byrne went for Fischer's queen. And this is what enabled a windmill. Bishop takes c4, check. Now the rook on e8 covers e1. That means the white king has to go to g1. This is a very, very typical sort of characteristic that to watch out for when you're trying to get a windmill to work, is try and see if the king is limited for squares, right? And if maybe you can force a situation where the initial check, you give a regular check initially, and you force the king to walk back into the line of fire, and you set up that discovered check on the second go round. So here comes the discovered check, knight takes d4. Now, in this particular case, white doesn't actually have to step back to g1. He could play rook to d3, but this would just be devastating because the rook is self-pinning, the bishop would fall, then the rook would fall sooner or later. It would just be horrific material loss, so white played king g1. But now knight steps back onto e2 with check, king f1, and the knight steps onto c3 with check, going after the rook on d1. So we see this powerful knight windmill. King steps onto g1, and now Bobby Fischer very accurately plays a takes b6, collecting the bishop, because the point is that now the white queen is hanging. Queen must step away to b4, trying to get at least the bishop for her troubles after the knight will take the rook, but Fischer is merciless. Rook a4, hitting the queen again and defending the bishop on c4. Queen takes b6 is just a pawn, and now knight takes rook. Finally, the dust has settled, and if we look at it at the material count, each side has a knight. Bobby Fischer is up a pawn, 2 bishops, and a rook for only a queen. This is far too much material, and Byrne's position is completely hopeless here. So, beautiful, beautiful game by Bobby Fischer, and so many people agree that it was really a great display, that this game is actually known, it got its title of the game of the century. So if you guys have never checked it out, I encourage you to check it out from the very beginning. It's a really beautiful game. Okay, so that is it for the first example, but I promised one more example, so let's check that out now. In this game, it was Alekhine, or, well, if you want to go with the proper Russian pronunciation, I think it's something closer to Alekhine, but most people know him as Alexander Alekhine, former world champion. And so here, Alekhine has played the move knight to h4. And to be honest, the situation is already looking grim for black, because if we look at this position, we see that, among other things, white has this tremendous protected pass pawn on e6. He has a huge deal of pressure on this knight and the pawn. The king is on h7 as well. Everything is lined up here, and things are looking pretty grim. Now, black does have some pressure on the queen side with this bishop on g7 and the queen pointing at a2, and this pawn majority on the queen side, but at the end of the day, that pales in comparison with the problems that black has over here on the king side and over here in the center. And already, if we see visually, we should be a little bit wary if we're black here, because we see that all of these points are lined up and being hit by the queen on d3. So the best move in this position is the move knight to g3. And with this move, black would at least have kept the game alive for a little bit longer. There's no immediate forcing continuations for white. But sure enough, maybe white might play something like rook to f3, hit the knight, and sooner or later he should be able to win. Now, the problem for black was, apart from having a bad position, was that there's a very sneaky trap contained here in this position. Now, the threat, the most apparent threat, is either knight takes f5 or bishop takes knight on e4. Both of them should be winning. So let's imagine black plays a silly move like rook to b7, white goes knight takes pawn, breaking down the support of that knight on e4, rook takes knight, and now bishop takes knight on e4, and this rook is paralyzed because of the fact that the black king is on h7. So this would be a huge amount of material loss, and the alternative line that we mentioned, which is bishop takes knight, pawn takes, queen takes, well, the king is in check, and after king h8, knight g6 check, soon, let's say king h7, knight takes rook, double check, the king must step back to h8, and now queen h7 is mate. So we see that the white threats are really very serious threats, but those appear to be the only threats. However, turns out that there is a third powerful threat, and black missed it. He played the move bishop to a6. Now, bishop to a6 is logical, attacks the queen and skewers the rook on f1, and doesn't allow white the time to take the knight. But Alekhine, being a fantastic attacking player, played queen takes knight instead on e4, f takes e4, bishop takes e4, check, king has to step to h8, and what we have here is once again a sort of a prison for the king here, imprisoned by his own pieces and pawns on g8, g7, and h6. So we have that first kind of major characteristic that we watch out for. And we also see that after knight g6 check, the king must step into the line of fire for a discovered check. So we have that second important and typical characteristic of a windmill. So now white grabbed the rook, and in this particular case, it gets even worse because in this case, the knight is also giving check. So this is a double discovered check. Now, the king has to step back to h8, and it's not only devastating material loss. In this particular case, the knight, being such a short range piece, cannot go to collect the queen or cannot collect the rook. The best it could do is go check, king to h7, and then maybe e7 check, king back to h8, and finally get to c6, not in time to win either the queen or the rook, but in time to fork and win an exchange there. Of course, Alekhine spots the bigger prize here, knight g6 check, king h7, and now a mating net, knight e5 check, king has to step back to h8, and the knight has rerouted to f7 and delivers checkmate. So this is, I think, also a very, very beautiful winning combination there, premised on the initial sacrifice here with the queen in order to create a windmill. Pawn takes, bishop takes, and from this point on, it's actually forced checkmate because of this clever rerouting after king here. Notice white doesn't immediately play knight e5 because the rook still remains here. Very typical again of a windmill, that you first sometimes have to be very careful about the order, right? That you go in first, you take the rook, and now there is no cover on that f7 square, and now you finally reroute to e5 and deliver checkmate from f7. So in my view, the most beautiful of all the examples, and I've tried to pick pleasing examples, is the Bobby Fischer game. But of course, you guys are free to disagree with that and have your own favorites, or perhaps an example you've seen a windmill or played a windmill that isn't included in this list. So that is your choice. But anyway, we are done with windmills. Just to recap, I hope you guys know what to watch out for. Basically, when there are limited squares for the enemy king, there may be a windmill possibility. And notice that a windmill is this combination of regular checks and discovered checks. Almost always that windmill is going to be involving a rook and a bishop, or at least a big percentage of the time. That's what I've found in my own experience. But some of the time, the windmill will involve a knight and a bishop instead. So keep an eye out for those two possibilities. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this section, and I will see you guys in the next one.